The moment I saw him shuffle into my emergency room, dirty clothes hanging off his thin frame, I made the same mistake that would haunt me for the rest of my career. I looked at him and saw everything I'd been taught to fear on the streets of Detroit. I saw danger. I saw trouble. I saw someone who didn't belong in my sterile, orderly world. I had no idea that this man had once saved 3 soldiers' lives in Iraq, or that his own life was hanging by a thread because of my prejudices. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Sarah Chen, and I used to think I was one of the good ones. Growing up as a second-generation Asian American in suburban Michigan, I'd worked twice as hard as my white classmates to prove I belonged. My parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with nothing but hope and determination, had sacrificed everything for my future. While my classmates were partying in high school, I was studying for the SATs until 2 in the morning. While they took gap years to find themselves, I was already in nursing school at 18, determined to build a life that would make my immigrant parents burst with pride. My childhood was a constant balancing act between 2 worlds. At home, we spoke Mandarin, ate traditional foods, and followed customs that dated back generations. At school, I desperately tried to fit in with my American peers, anglicizing my name from Shuling to Sarah, packing peanut butter sandwiches instead of the dumplings my mother lovingly prepared, and pretending I didn't understand when kids made jokes about Ching-chong accents. The racism I experienced was usually subtle: the surprised looks when I spoke without an accent, the assumptions that I was good at math but couldn't be creative, the way teachers would automatically group me with the other Asian students regardless of our actual interests or abilities. I learned early that success was my shield against discrimination. If I was perfect, if I achieved more than everyone else, then no one could question whether I belonged. By 28, I had everything I thought I wanted. I was the charge nurse at Detroit General's emergency department, one of the youngest ever to hold that position. I was respected by my colleagues, trusted by doctors, and finally earning enough to help my parents with their mortgage and my younger brother's college tuition. I drove a reliable Honda Civic, lived in a safe apartment complex in Troy, Michigan, and had even started dating Marcus, a software engineer who made me laugh and never made me feel like I had to choose between honoring my heritage and embracing my American identity. Marcus was everything my parents had dreamed of for me: successful, educated, respectful, and best of all, he was also Asian American, which meant our children would understand the delicate dance of cultural identity that had defined my entire life. We'd been together for 8 months, and I was starting to imagine a future with him, one where I could finally relax into the life I'd worked so hard to build. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd made it. I belonged somewhere. I was somebody important, someone whose opinion mattered, someone who had earned her place in American society through hard work and determination. But success, I learned, can be its own kind of blindness. When you've spent your whole life fighting to prove you're worthy of respect, it becomes easy to look down on those who haven't made it the way you have. It becomes easy to forget that dignity isn't something we earn, it's something we're born with. It was a Tuesday night in November when everything changed. Detroit General's emergency room was unusually quiet for a weeknight. Just a few routine cases and the regular crowd of patients seeking warmth and a hot meal disguised as medical emergencies. The autumn air had turned bitter cold, and we always saw an uptick in homeless individuals looking for shelter when the temperature dropped below freezing. I was catching up on paperwork, enjoying the relative calm after a hectic weekend that had seen 3 car accidents, 2 domestic violence cases, and a gang shooting that had kept us busy for hours. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar harsh glow over the sterile white walls and blue linoleum floors. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee from the break room, creating the distinctive scent that had become as familiar to me as my own perfume. At 9:47 p.m., the automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh, and he walked in. He moved slowly, each step deliberate and careful, as if every movement caused him pain. Even from across the reception area, I could smell him. A mixture of unwashed clothes, cigarettes, stale sweat, and something else I couldn't identify, but that immediately put me on guard. His dark skin was weathered and scarred, his hair matted and unkempt beneath a dirty baseball cap. He wore a torn military jacket that had clearly seen better decades. The olive green fabric faded and stained, with patches sewn on haphazardly. His jeans were ripped at the knees, not fashionably, but from wear and need, and his boots were held together with duct tape and prayers. "Great," I muttered under my breath to Melissa, the night receptionist, a young woman fresh out of college who was working the job to pay off student loans while she figured out what she really wanted to do with her life. Another one looking for a warm place to sleep. Melissa glanced up from her computer screen and nodded knowingly. We'd developed a kind of shorthand over the months we'd worked together, an unspoken understanding about the different types of patients who came through our doors. There were the genuine emergencies, heart attacks, strokes, accidents that required immediate intervention. There were the worried parents with sick children, the elderly with mysterious symptoms, the working people who couldn't afford to take time off during the day. And then there were the others, the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, who used the emergency room as their primary care physician because they had nowhere else to go. The man approached the desk hesitantly, his eyes darting around nervously as if he expected to be turned away at any moment. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Melissa had to lean forward to hear him, her blonde ponytail swinging as she tilted her head. I need to see someone," he said, his words careful and measured. "My chest. It hurts real bad. Been hurting for days now." I watched from my station as Melissa handed him the standard intake forms clipped to a blue plastic clipboard. He stared at them for a long moment, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the papers. Then he looked back up at her, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Was it embarrassment? Shame? Could you help me with these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't. My hands shake too much to write good." Melissa glanced over at me, and I saw my own thoughts reflected in her expression. Another homeless person trying to game the system. Another person who'd probably been drinking or using drugs, now looking for a free ride and maybe some pain medication to sell on the street. It was a story we'd seen dozens of times. People who claimed they couldn't read or write because they thought it would get them seen faster or generate more sympathy. "Just get him through triage," I told her quietly, my voice low enough that the man couldn't hear. "Check his vitals and we'll see what we're dealing with." When it was my turn to assess him in the small triage room, I put on my professional mask. The calm, competent demeanor I'd perfected over years of dealing with difficult patients. I dealt with hundreds of homeless patients over the years. Most were harmless, just looking for a meal and a warm bed. Some were genuinely sick and needed help. But others were unpredictable, especially if they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and I'd learned to be cautious. The triage room was small and cramped, with barely enough space for the examination table a rolling stool, and a small desk with a computer. The walls were painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the hospital, broken only by a few mandatory posters about hand hygiene and patient rights. I gestured for him to sit on the examination table, the paper crinkling under his weight as he settled himself carefully. "Name?" I asked, not looking up from my clipboard as I prepared to fill out his assessment form. "James Washington," he replied, his voice still barely above a whisper. "Date of birth?" "March 15th, 1965. I glanced up, surprised. He looked much older than 57, his face lined and weathered far beyond his years. His skin had the grayish pallor of someone who spent too much time outdoors in harsh weather, and his eyes held a tired resignation that spoke of years of disappointment and hardship. "Address?" I continued, though I already knew what the answer would be. "Don't have one right now," he said, looking down at his hands. "Been staying at the shelter when there's space, or wherever I can find." I made a note on his chart and continued with the standard questions. "What brings you in tonight, Mr. Washington?" He pressed his hand to his chest, wincing slightly as he did so. "Been having chest pains for about a week now, getting worse every day. And I've been having trouble breathing when I walk. Even just walking across the street leaves me winded." It was a standard presentation for someone looking to get admitted overnight, I thought cynically. Chest pain was the golden ticket. Hospitals couldn't legally turn you away if you complained of cardiac symptoms, and everyone on the street knew it. The fact that "What's his medical history?" Dr. Martinez asked urgently as nurses hooked James up to monitors. The machines immediately began their urgent chorus of beeps and alarms. "Homeless male, 57 years old, possible drug-seeking behavior, no significant medical history reported." I rattled off automatically, repeating the assessment I'd made hours earlier. The monitors told a different story. James's heart rhythm was dangerously irregular, jumping erratically across the screen. His oxygen saturation was dropping rapidly, and his blood pressure was spiking to dangerous levels. "This isn't drug-seeking," Dr. Martinez said grimly, her hands flying over James's chest as she listened with her stethoscope. "We're looking at acute coronary syndrome, possibly a massive MI. Get me cardiology, stat, and prep him for immediate intervention." As the trauma team worked to stabilize James, starting IVs, administering medications, preparing for emergency procedures, I knelt down to collect the scattered papers from his chart. Among the intake forms and insurance paperwork, my hands closed around something that made my blood freeze. It was a photocopy of a military discharge document, partially visible beneath the standard hospital forms. But it wasn't just any discharge. It was a DD-214 form, the official military discharge document, and across the top, I could see commendations listed in official military typography. With shaking hands, I picked up the paper and read the details that would change everything. Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor in combat. Purple Heart Medal, Combat Infantry Badge, Army Commendation Medal, Service, United States, Army 82nd Airborne Division, Rank at Discharge, Staff Sergeant. Tours of Duty, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2003 to 2004, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2005 to 2006. Below that, in smaller text that made my chest tighten with each word, Wounded in Action, Fallujah, Iraq, November 12, 2004. Shrapnel wounds to chest and left arm resulting in 40% permanent disability rating. Recommended for continued cardiac monitoring due to proximity of shrapnel to heart. My hands began to shake as I continued reading. This man, this man I'd dismissed as just another homeless person looking for a handout, was a decorated war veteran who'd literally taken shrapnel to the chest defending our country. He wasn't some drug addict or malingerer. He was a hero who'd risked his life for people like me. But there was more. Clipped to the back of the military documents was a small newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. The headline read, "Local hero returns from Iraq to start new life." Below it was a photograph that made my breath catch in my throat. It was James Washington, but a James Washington I never could have imagined. He was younger, maybe 39 or 40, standing tall and proud in his army dress uniform. The jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleaming, the ribbons and medals displayed across his chest, telling the story of his service and sacrifice. But what struck me most was his smile. He was standing next to a beautiful Hispanic woman in a white wedding dress, her dark hair adorned with small white flowers, her face radiant with joy. Beside them stood a small girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a pink flower girl dress and holding a bouquet that was almost as big as she was. James had his arm around both of them, and the smile on his face was genuine and transformative, full of hope, love, and the promise of a bright future. The caption read, "Staff Sergeant James Washington returns home to Detroit after his second tour in Iraq to marry his fiancée, Rosa Martinez, and adopt her daughter, Sophia." Washington was awarded the Bronze Star for his heroic actions in saving 3 fellow soldiers during an IED attack in Fallujah that left him with severe injuries. "I'm just glad to be home with my family," Washington said. "Now I can focus on building the life Rosa and I have dreamed about." I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the proud, hopeful soldier with the broken man we were now fighting to save in Trauma Bay 2. What had happened to transform this decorated veteran into the homeless man I'd so callously dismissed? "What's his medical history?" Dr. Martinez asked urgently as nurses hooked James up to monitors. The machines immediately began their urgent chorus of beeps and alarms. "Homeless male, 57 years old, possible drug-seeking behavior, no significant medical history reported," I rattled off automatically, repeating the assessment I'd made hours earlier. The monitors told a different story. James's heart rhythm was dangerously irregular, jumping erratically across the screen. His oxygen saturation was dropping rapidly, and his blood pressure was spiking to dangerous levels. "This isn't drug-seeking," Dr. Martinez said grimly, her hands flying over James's chest as she listened with her stethoscope. "We're looking at acute coronary syndrome, possibly a massive MI. Get me cardiology, stat, and prep him for immediate intervention." As the trauma team worked to stabilize James, starting IVs, administering medications, preparing for emergency procedures, I knelt down to collect the scattered papers from his chart. Among the intake forms and insurance paperwork, my hands closed around something that made my blood freeze. It was a photocopy of a military discharge document, partially visible beneath the standard hospital forms. But it wasn't just any discharge. It was a DD-214 form, the official military discharge document, and across the top, I could see commendations listed in official military typography. With shaking hands, I picked up the paper and read the details that would change everything. Bronze Star Medal with V device for valor in combat, Purple Heart Medal, Combat Infantry Badge, Army Commendation Medal, Service United States, Army 82nd Airborne Division, rank at discharge, Staff Sergeant. Tours of Duty, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2003 to 2004. Operation Enduring Freedom, 2005 to 2006. Below that, in smaller text that made my chest tighten with each word. Wounded in Action, Fallujah, Iraq, November 12, 2004. Shrapnel wounds to chest and left arm resulting in 40% permanent disability rating. Recommended for continued cardiac monitoring due to proximity of shrapnel to heart. My hands began to shake as I continued reading. This man I'd dismissed as just another homeless person looking for a handout, was a decorated war veteran who'd literally taken shrapnel to the chest defending our country. He wasn't some drug addict or malingerer. He was a hero who'd risked his life for people like me. But there was more. Clipped to the back of the military documents was a small newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. The headline read, "Local hero returns from Iraq to start new life." Below it was a photograph that made my breath catch in my throat. It was James Washington, but a James Washington I never could have imagined. He was younger, maybe 39 or 40, standing tall and proud in his army dress uniform. The jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleaming, the ribbons and medals displayed across his chest, telling the story of his service and sacrifice. But what struck me most was his smile. He was standing next to a beautiful Hispanic woman in a white wedding dress, her dark hair adorned with small white flowers, her face radiant with joy. Beside them stood a small girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a pink flower girl dress and holding a bouquet that was almost as big as she was. James had his arm around both of them, and the smile on his face was genuine and transformative, full of hope, love, and the promise of a bright future. The caption read, "Staff Sergeant James Washington returns home to Detroit after his second tour in Iraq to marry his fiancée, Rosa Martinez, and adopt her daughter, Sophia." Washington was awarded the Bronze Star for his heroic actions in saving 3 fellow soldiers during an IED attack in Fallujah that left him with severe injuries. "I'm just glad to be home with my family," Washington said. "Now I can focus on building the life Rosa and I have dreamed about." I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the proud, hopeful soldier with the broken man we were now fighting to save in Trauma Bay 2. What had happened to transform this decorated veteran into the homeless man I'd so callously dismissed? There was one more document, this one more recent and far more heartbreaking. It was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, dated just 6 months ago. The official letterhead stark against the white paper. "Dear Mr. Washington, we regret to inform you that your application for emergency housing assistance has been denied due to incomplete documentation. Additionally, your request for increased disability compensation related to cardiac issues stemming from your combat injuries requires additional medical evidence that you have failed to provide within the required timeframe. Your current disability rating of 40% will remain unchanged until such evidence is submitted. Please note that failure to attend scheduled appointments or provide requested documentation may result in suspension of benefits. We appreciate your service to our country and encourage you to resubmit your application with complete documentation." The letter went on, full of bureaucratic language and impossible requirements that essentially said, "We know you're suffering. We know you served your country with honor, but we need more proof before we'll help you." "Sarah." Dr. Martinez's voice cut through my shock like a knife. "I need you over here. His rhythm is deteriorating." I stumbled to my feet, the documents clutched in my trembling hand, and rejoined the team working frantically to save James's life. But now, Everything was different. This wasn't just another patient. This was a man who'd served his country with distinction, who'd been wounded in combat defending the freedoms I took for granted, who'd fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to take care of its heroes. As I helped administer medications and monitored his vital signs, I found myself really looking at James Washington for the first time. The scars on his arms weren't from drug use. They were surgical scars, probably from treating his combat wounds. The way he'd moved so carefully when he walked in wasn't the shuffle of someone high or drunk. It was the gait of someone living with chronic pain from shrapnel still lodged near his heart. And those eyes that had made me so uncomfortable, they weren't the eyes of someone trying to con the system. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen the horrors of war, who'd lost everything that mattered to him, and who'd finally reached the point where pride couldn't keep him from asking for help. "We've got him stabilized," Dr. Martinez announced, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes of intensive intervention. "He's had a significant cardiac event. Looks like a massive myocardial infarction triggered by underlying coronary artery disease, probably exacerbated by stress and his untreated combat injuries. But he's going to make it. Sarah, can you get him prepped for transfer to the cardiac ICU?" As James was wheeled up to the cardiac intensive care unit, I found myself following the gurney, unable to let go of the documents in my hand. The elevator ride felt eternal, the soft ding of each floor a countdown to a reckoning I wasn't prepared for. When we reached the ICU and James was settled into his room, a private space filled with monitors and machines that would keep his damaged heart beating, I pulled up a chair beside his bed. The cardiac ICU was quieter than the emergency room, the lighting softer, the atmosphere more contemplative. Through the window, I could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the Detroit skyline. James was conscious now, though groggy from the medications that were keeping his heart rhythm stable and his pain manageable. When he saw me sitting beside his bed, he tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper through the oxygen mask. "Thank you," he managed to say, his words slightly muffled but clear enough. I know you didn't want to help someone like me." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making my chest tighten with shame. "Mr. Washington, It's okay," he said softly, reaching up to adjust his oxygen mask so he could speak more clearly. "I'm used to it. Ever since I came back, ever since Rosa died and I lost the house, people look at me different, like I'm not human anymore." I felt tears building in my eyes, hot and stinging with the weight of my guilt. "I found these," I said, holding up his military documents with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have." He looked at the papers and smiled sadly, a ghost of the radiant smile from his wedding photo. "Would it have mattered? If you'd known?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I realized that it cut to the heart of everything that was wrong, not just with me, but with how we treat people we deem unworthy of our compassion. The question forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I had judged him not on his individual merits or his need for help, but on his appearance and circumstances. "It should have mattered," I said finally, my voice breaking with emotion. "But more than that, you should have mattered regardless. You shouldn't have had to prove your worth with medals and service records to receive basic human decency." Over the next few days, as James recovered from his heart attack, because that's what it had been, a massive cardiac event likely triggered by the stress of living on the streets and exacerbated by his untreated combat injuries. I learned the rest of his story. I spent my breaks sitting beside his bed, listening as he shared the details of a life that had started with such promise and descended into tragedy through a series of circumstances largely beyond his control. He'd enlisted in the Army right out of high school, driven by a desire to serve his country and to gain the skills and education that would help him build a better life. His first tour in Iraq had been difficult but manageable. He'd served with distinction, earned the respect of his fellow soldiers, and returned home to a hero's welcome and the love of his life. Rosa Martinez. Rosa had been a teacher at a local elementary school, a woman whose warmth and compassion had drawn James like a beacon. She'd already been raising her daughter Sophia from a previous relationship, but James had embraced them both as his own family. Their wedding had been small but perfect, surrounded by friends and family who believed in their future together. But James's second tour had changed everything. The IED that earned him his Bronze Star had also left him with chronic pain, PTSD that went undiagnosed for years, and a heart condition that the VA had been slow to recognize and even slower to treat. The shrapnel that remained lodged near his heart was a constant reminder of that day in Fallujah when he'd thrown himself on top of 3 younger soldiers to shield them from an explosion. "I'd do it again," he told me one afternoon as I checked his IV and adjusted his medications. Those boys, they were barely 19, 20 years old. They had their whole lives ahead of them. If my getting hurt meant they got to go home to their families, then it was worth it. When James returned from his second tour, Rosa had been patient and understanding as he struggled with nightmares, panic attacks, and chronic pain that sometimes left him unable to work for days at a time. She'd driven him to countless VA appointments, helped him fill out forms, advocated for him when the system failed to provide the care he needed. "Rosa was my anchor," James continued, his voice soft with memory. "When the nightmares got bad, when the pain was too much, when I felt like I was drowning, she kept me afloat. She never made me feel broken or damaged. She just loved me." For 3 years, they'd built a life together. James had used his GI benefits to study automotive repair, and he'd found work at a local garage. Rosa continued teaching, and together they'd saved money for a small house in a safe neighborhood where Sophia could grow up. They'd talked about having more children, about growing old together, about all the dreams that young couples share. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening in March 2009, everything fell apart. Rosa was driving home from a parent-teacher conference when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car. She died instantly, and with her died all of James's hopes for the future. "I fell apart," James admitted, his eyes distant as he relived the memories. "Completely fell apart. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't work." Sophia went to live with Rosa's sister in California, which was the right thing. She needed stability. But losing both of them at once, it broke something in me that I didn't know how to fix. The grief had triggered a downward spiral that James couldn't stop. His untreated PTSD combined with his overwhelming loss had led to a depression so severe that he'd stopped going to work, stopped paying bills, stopped taking care of himself. The VA's bureaucratic maze had become impossible to navigate alone, and without Rosa's help and advocacy, James had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to support him. "I tried to get help," he told me, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But every office I went to, every form I filled out, they made me feel like I was begging, like I should be grateful for scraps instead of receiving what I'd earned through my service." The house had been the first thing to go, followed by his job, his car, and eventually his hope. The VA had promised help that never materialized. disability payments that were delayed for months while they processed his claims, and medical care that was always just out of reach due to missing paperwork or scheduling conflicts. The chest pain started getting really bad about 6 months ago, he continued. But every time I came to a hospital or clinic, I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was faking it, looking for drugs or trying to get a bed for the night. I guess I can't blame them. I know what I look like. Why didn't you tell them about your military service? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Detroit skyline. Because I shouldn't have to, he said finally. My service doesn't make me more worthy of compassion than anyone else living on the streets. There are plenty of homeless folks who never wore a uniform, and they deserve to be treated with dignity too. His words stayed with me long after my shift ended. James Washington was discharged from the hospital a week later, but not to the streets. Word of his story had spread through the hospital like wildfire, and someone had connected him with a veterans service organization that specialized in helping homeless veterans navigate the VA system and find stable housing. Within a month, he had a small apartment in a transitional housing program and was finally receiving the comprehensive cardiac care he needed. But the real change wasn't in his circumstances. It was in me. I'd spent my entire life working to prove that I belonged, that I was worthy of respect and success in America. I'd believed that my hard work and achievements had earned me the right to judge others, to assume that those who hadn't made it must have failed through some personal shortcoming. I'd looked at James Washington and seen everything I'd been taught to fear and avoid, never imagining that he might have sacrificed more for this country than I ever had. The revelation of his service had shattered my assumptions, but it had also revealed a deeper truth. His military service wasn't what made him worthy of respect and compassion. His humanity was enough. Every person who walked through our emergency room doors deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, their appearance, or their perceived social value. I started volunteering at a homeless shelter downtown, not as someone bringing charity to the deserving poor, but as someone trying to understand and see the full humanity in every person who walked through those doors. I discovered former teachers, artists, factory workers, mothers, fathers, people whose stories were as complex and worthy as my own. People who'd been reduced to a single dimension by a society that preferred simple narratives about success and failure. The woman sleeping in the corner had been a nurse like me until a car accident, and subsequent addiction to prescription painkillers had cost her everything. The man serving food had been a successful businessman until his company folded and he'd lost his house, his family, and his sense of purpose. The teenager huddled by the door had aged out of foster care with no family, no support system, and no skills to navigate the adult world. Each story reminded me that the line between us and them was far thinner than I'd ever imagined. I was just a few bad breaks, a medical emergency, a job loss, or a family tragedy away from being in their position. The only difference between James Washington and me was luck, circumstance, and the systems of support that had been available to us. I also spoke up when I saw other healthcare workers making the same assumptions I had made. When Jennifer made a snide comment about a patient's appearance, I pulled her aside and shared James's story. When Kevin suggested that someone was probably just drug-seeking, I reminded him that our job was to heal, not to judge. The change wasn't always popular. Some colleagues thought I'd gone soft, that I was being naive about the realities of emergency medicine. There were budget concerns and efficiency metrics to consider, they argued. We couldn't save everyone, and we certainly couldn't solve the complex social problems that brought people to our doors. But I'd learned something that my years of education and professional success hadn't taught me. The realities of emergency medicine include the reality that every person who walks through our doors is carrying a story we can't see, fighting battles we don't understand, hoping for compassion from people who hold their dignity in their hands. 6 months later, James Washington came back to the ER, not as a patient, but as a volunteer with the Veterans Outreach Program. The transformation was remarkable. He'd gained weight, his eyes were clearer, and he carried himself with the dignity I'd failed to see that first night. He wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, clothes that fit properly, and spoke of stability and self-respect. "I wanted to thank you," he said when he found me during my break. "Not just for saving my life, but for seeing me, for really seeing me." "I should be thanking you," I replied, meaning every word. "You taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." "What's that?" "That compassion isn't something we should have to earn. It's something we owe each other, just for being human." He smiled then, the same genuine, transformative smile I'd seen in that old newspaper photo. And I realized that healing goes both ways. Yes, we'd helped save his life that night, but he'd saved something in me too. My capacity for empathy, my ability to see beyond. As I tell you this story today, 3 years have passed since James Washington first walked into our emergency room. He's now working full-time as a patient advocate, helping other veterans and homeless individuals navigate healthcare systems and access the services they need. He's remarried, a wonderful woman named Patricia who volunteers at the same Veterans Center. And he's been able to reconnect with Sophia, Rosa's daughter, who's now in college studying social work. But the most important change isn't in any of our individual stories. It's in the countless patients who have received care at our hospital and never had to experience the dehumanization that was once commonplace. It's in the healthcare workers who have learned to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the dignity inherent in every human being. Every day, I'm reminded of the lesson James taught me without meaning to. The homeless teenager struggling with addiction deserves compassion. The undocumented immigrant afraid to seek care deserves respect. The elderly person with dementia who can't remember your name deserves patience. The person with mental illness who doesn't present their symptoms in neat, clinical packages deserves understanding. They all deserve it because dignity isn't earned through achievements or circumstances or appearance. Dignity is inherent to being human. Sometimes I think about the nurse I was before that November night. Competent, successful, proud of my achievements, but blind to my own prejudices. I think about all the James Washingtons I had failed to see over the years, all the opportunities for compassion I had missed because I was too busy categorizing people based on my own limited perspective. I can't change those missed opportunities, but I can make sure they don't happen again. Every patient who walks through our doors now is seen, really seen, as a complete human being deserving of respect, care, and dignity. The work of seeing each other's full humanity isn't just the responsibility of healthcare workers. It's something we all must do, in every interaction, every day. Because you never know when the person you're quickest to dismiss might be carrying invisible scars from serving your country, or working multiple jobs to feed their children, or grieving a loss so profound it's broken them temporarily. You never know when the person you judge by their appearance might be the one who teaches you the most important lesson of your life. James Washington taught me that they judged him by his circumstances, but he showed me, the content of his character. And in doing so, he didn't just save his own life that night. He saved mine too, and the lives of countless others who would benefit from the compassion he helped me learn to give. In a world that often teaches us to look away from suffering, to protect ourselves by creating distance from those who struggle, James Washington reminded me that our humanity is not diminished by extending compassion. It's enhanced by it. The next time you encounter someone society has taught you to fear, dismiss, or judge, remember this story. Remember that behind every face is a story you don't know, a struggle you haven't witnessed, a dignity that exists whether you choose to see it or not. And remember that in choosing to see, in choosing compassion over judgment, you might just discover that the person you thought needed saving was actually the one saving you. Because in the end, we are all more than the worst thing that's ever happened to us, more than our lowest moment, more than the assumptions others place on us. We are all worthy of love, respect, and basic human dignity, not because of what we've achieved or how we look, but simply because we exist. That's the lesson James Washington taught me, and it's a lesson I carry with me every single day. They judged him by his appearance. He showed them the strength of his soul, and in doing so, he reminded all of us what it truly means to be human.